This morning's Old Testament reading is from Exodus. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I am the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You should not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. This morning's epistle reading is from 1 Corinthians. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Word from this morning's sermon, this morning's lectionary, that you hardly ever hear anymore. Let's all say the word together, shall we? Thwart. Say it. Thwart. That's a great word. Here's another word, zeal. What is zeal? I saw Carol go, you know, zeal is like this. Yeah, it is. What is it?
Explosive energy.
Pardon? Explosive energy. Wow. She must have read ahead on the sermon text.
Got that old dictionary.
She's pretty tricky. Hey, we're sorry Eric is sick. We should have prayed for him. Eric is really under the weather. That's why he wasn't up here this morning. Yeah, zeal. I want you to think this morning as we investigate our sermon text. The difference between zeal and aspiration. The difference between zeal and aspiration. Almost all of us have some aspirations. Most of us do not possess zeal. And it comes up in today's sermon text. Let's read from John's Gospel, chapter 2, beginning at verse 13. John 2, 13 through 22. I read from the New International Version. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here! How can you turn my Father's house into a market?" His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Then the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken. This event, the cleaning of the temple by Jesus, is recorded in all 4 of the Gospels in the New Testament. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke all place this event during Holy Week. Shortly after Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, came to town for the last time, came to town for his last Passover, came to town in order that he would become the Passover lamb himself. John, this is one of the reasons why John's Gospel is not one of the synoptics, because it is different markedly from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John places this story just a few days after Jesus' first public miracle. It wasn't really public. The turning of water to wine at the wedding feast in Cana. So he goes from being baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptizer, his cousin, to 40 days in the wilderness, which we mark every year with Lent, to a small wedding feast in Cana. He gathered some disciples along the way. And there, as you know the story, his mother said, "They're out of wine." And Jesus said, "What's that to me? I'm not about that." But he did make it possible for every wedding guest to have the finest wine they had ever tasted. And he used one product, water. Now, he has gone to Capernaum with his family. This is also in John 2, and some scholars suggest perhaps this is after Joseph, his earthly father, died. The family relocated from Nazareth to Capernaum. And then it's Passover, and of course, every male Jew within 15 miles of Jerusalem was required to go to Passover at the temple. And some scholars suggest that the city of Jerusalem, which was a pretty big town for its day, became a metropolis during Passover week. Some people say as many as 2 million people. That sounds hard to handle. Most scholars believe at the very least, the city doubled in size overnight for a full week, actually for 2 weeks. And so Jesus goes to Passover. when he gets there, he goes to the temple. And that's where all this action begins. Now, I wonder as I studied, gee, did Matthew, Mark, and Luke have it right, placing this the last week of this event, the last week of Jesus' life during Holy Week? That's how most of us first heard the story, I think, in conjunction with the Passion narrative. And it does fit in rather nicely there. John, for whatever reason, has it right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and it fits there too. I think I'll try to show you why in a couple of minutes. John MacArthur suggests maybe there were two cleansings. There could well have been, who knows. Or John, who was never that serious about chronological history in his gospel, might have put it here for his own purposes. We don't know. We're left to wonder. It's okay. But I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the temple. Hope you'll bear with me. You know I took a history major at George Mason. I can't help myself. The Temple of John 2 was actually the third one erected in Jerusalem. More than 1,000 years earlier, after his defeat of the Philistines and the rescue of the Ark of the Covenant, King David declared his intention to build a grand house for Yahweh. A great temple which he hoped would become the permanent dwelling place of God in Israel. But he was denied that honor by God himself, though he was promised that through one of his descendants, the kingdom of God would be established forever. That descendant, of course, we believe was Jesus Christ. So it fell to Solomon, David's son by Bathsheba, to build the first temple, probably around 1000 BC, and to personally dedicate it, after which it was spectacularly anointed by God. Remember the story in 2 Chronicles? When the dedication service is coming to an end, and Solomon prays his prayer, and the glory of God came into the Holy of Holies. Spectacular authorization, I think, by Yahweh. Jerusalem was nearly destroyed in Solomon's spectacular temple, sacked and burned to the ground in 587 BC by the armies of Nebuchadnezzar II. Most of those who did not die in that invasion were carted off to captivity in Babylon. Jerusalem lay in ruin for 70 years, just as Jeremiah had promised. During that time, the armies of Persia defeated and displaced the Babylonians. And 50 years later, the construction of a second temple was authorized by Cyrus the Great, who sent the Jewish exiles he had inherited back to Jerusalem to build it under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. And you probably remember that, don't you? Much smaller and less imposing than the first temple. Remember at the dedication service, when Ezra was reading the law, the people were crying because the temple was such a sorry replica of the first one. And just they remembered the first one, that they'd heard about it from their parents perhaps, and this was fine, but this was nothing like Solomon's temple. Much smaller and less imposing than the first temple, it was begun in 538 BC, dedicated by Zerubbabel, the appointed governor of Israel, 23 years later. The second temple narrowly missed being destroyed by Alexander the Great. Did you know that? Who intended to and then changed his plans at the last minute. And it also survived several outrageous desecrations over the years. After his murderous invasion of Jerusalem in 167 BC, the Greek emperor Antiochus Epiphanes IV, in an attempt to Hellenize the Jews, forbade Sabbath worship, canceled all festivals, and made illegal the circumcision of male infants.